Last time we spoke about the end of the land campaign for the Russo-Japanese War, the Battle of Mukden. Kuropatkin had been served a defeat after a defeat after a defeat. Now he found himself against the wall at Mukden. Meanwhile, Oyama received reinforcements in the form of General Nogi's 3rd IGA, and he created the 5th IGA under Kawamura. Pretending the 5th IGA was a full-strength army, Oyama unleashed a devilish deception against Kuropatkin's eastern flank. Kuropatkin took a defensive stance, handing the initiative completely to Oyama, who performed a full crescent pincer attack against his army. Using Nogi's 3rd IGA as a surprise left pincer, Oyama attempted defeating the Russians once and for all, but yet again, Kuropatkin's army was able to flee intact. Despite taking the majority of his army further north into Manchuria, the Russians were in no position to launch a counteroffensive, and now all hope for their cause lay upon the arrival of the Baltic Fleet. This episode is the Russo-Japanese War Part 10, the Battle of Tsushima. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, I just released a full documentary series on many of the medals of honor earned during the Battle for Guadalcanal with Dave Holland. Also, do please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for more exclusive podcasts. This month's exclusive podcast over there is me explaining why the Japanese army performed so many atrocities during World War II. It is a rather gruesome episode. Check it out, it means a lot to me. As Kuropatkin was withdrawing to a new line of defense at Suping, Tsar Nicholas II would write in his diary, "It is painful and distressing." But the pain and distress had only just begun. All the way back in October of 1904, Rear Admiral Zinovy Petrovich Rodzhestvenskiy, and oh boy, I wrote that name probably 80 times in this script. It's going to be a very hard one to keep saying. Rodzhestvenskiy was the commander-in-chief of the Baltic Fleet, and he was given command of the new 2nd Pacific Squadron. His new fleet departed Kronstadt on October the 15th and would be facing an incredible and very difficult journey. The logistics of the fleet's deployment were colossal. It was estimated the fleet would require 3,000 tons of coal per day at economic speed. That would be about 10,000 tons at full speed. Most great powers with large navies had coaling stations within their spheres of influence. Russia did not. Of the great powers, she had no significant overseas colonies. Under international law, neutral ports were forbidden from providing support to warships. Britain held numerous coaling stations but was allied to Japan. Thus, Russia sought aid from France and Germany. France agreed to allow their coaling stations to be used, and Germany supplied a fleet of 60 courriers to perform coal-ups. Rozdivensky took the battleship Knyaz Suvorov for his flagship. Along with her was Orel, Alexander III, and Borodino, comprising the 1st Battleship Division. The 2nd Battleship Division was led by Rear Admiral Felkazam, and it had the older battleships Oselabia, the flag, Sisoy, Veliki, and Navarin. The 1st Cruiser Division was led by Rear Admiral Enquist, and it had Dmitry Donskoy, the flagship, Svetlana, Oleg, Izumrud, Zhemchug, Aurora, and Admiral Nakimov. The movement of the 2nd Pacific Squadron through the Baltic was very painful. There were endless delays because of ships requiring repairs, to coal up, and mine-clearing operations were always ongoing. Rodzhestvenskiy ordered, "No vessel of any sort must be allowed to get in among the fleet." fueled by rumors the IJN sought to ambush them using torpedo boats. When the fleet reached Dogger Bank on the night of October the 21st, jittery Russian crewmates aboard the repair ship Kamchatka, last in the Russian line, saw something. The Kamchatka had lost touch with the fleet and saw a Swedish merchantman of the Gamecock fishing fleet operating out of Hull. Kamchatka sent a contact report to the rest of the fleet stating, "Being chased by torpedo boats." Hearts leapt throughout the fleet. Thousands of sailors peered over the rails into the sea. Suvorov signaled, "How many? From which direction?" Kamchatka responded, "About 8 from all directions." Sailor Politvosky recalled when all hell broke loose. A small steam was rolling helpless on the sea. One funnel, a bridge, and the red and black paint on her side was clearly visible. First one, then another projectile from our ship struck the unfortunate steamer. They were, no doubt, fishermen. Now there will be a universal scandal. Facing the Russians was a 100-ton trawler named the Crane, with fishermen aboard literally holding up fish to the searchlights trying to indicate what they were. They were boats of the Gamecock fleet operating out of Hull in the traditional fishing grounds of Dogger Bank. A young Joseph Alfred Smith was awoken by gunfire. He ran up the deck to find his father and third hand both headless in a pool of blood. The rest of the crew were wounded. The first hand frantically waved a red lantern as the little boat began to sink. 3 other trawlers rushed over to try and pick up Crane's men, as Rostevensky realized his fleet was firing upon British fishing boats. Rostevensky signaled to cease fire, but then other ships of the Baltic Fleet came into the area, prompting those firing on the fishermen to begin firing upon them. A firefight broke out between the battleships and the cruisers, and some received hits. Borel fired 500 rounds, hitting Dmitry Donskoy and Aurora a few times. 2 Russians were killed from friendly fire, and the battleship Aurora took a hit below her waterline. The chaos went on for 25 minutes, and several Russian ships signaled torpedoes were being fired upon them. The Borodino even sent a report stating she believed she was about to be boarded by Japanese. Finally, Suvorov put up a blue light signaling to cease fire before sailing off without even providing any lifeboats to the ailing fishermen. The battered fishermen returned to Hull with their dead, and news of the incident spread like wildfire. The infamous incident became known as the Dogger Bank Incident. The attack on the British fishing ships was seen as an act of war. The British Admiralty put out the Home, Channel, and Mediterranean fleets on a war footing, as masses of protesters hit Trafalgar Square, demanding justice. Rostevensky was completely unaware of everything until he hit their first port of call at Vigo. Spain immediately passed on the message from the British. Rostevensky sent a signal claiming that the attack on the Gamecock fleet had been just an accident. He argued his officers believed 2 torpedo boats were in the vicinity and that every effort had been made to avoid the imprudent fishing boats. Rostevensky apologized and asked, quote, "To express our sincere regret for the unfortunate victims of circumstances in which no warship could, even in the times of profound peace, have acted otherwise." So yeah, this great journey had kind of a rough start. After averting war with the British, Rostevensky's fleet continued on, and at Tangier he decided to split up in 2. He believed the older ships would not survive the long journey around the Cape, so he sent them through the Suez Canal route led by Admiral Felkersam. Rostevensky's fleet hit port after port, coaling up and carrying on. Coaling up on the southern hemisphere, where temperatures could hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit, saw men die of sunstroke. Sir Winston Churchill would actually write on this subject. "The ordeal of coaling exhausted the whole ship's company. In wartime, it robbed them of their brief period of rest. It subjected everyone to extreme discomfort. Each port they came to coal at brought them news of the war. At Diego Cerez in Madagascar, the Russians heard news 203-meter hill had fallen to the Japanese. Rostevensky had said, 203-meter hill. What is that? They departed West Africa on December the 17th, and now Rozhdestvensky needed to link back up with Felkazam's squadron and make it post-haste to rescue Port Arthur. However, Felkazam had a shorter route and should have reached Diego Ceres before Rozhdestvensky, but he had not. It would turn out St. Petersburg redirected Felkazam to Nasibi, 600 miles distant, causing great delays. Rozhdestvensky, outraged, raced towards Nasibi, but along the way received disastrous news. Port Arthur had fallen. Without Whitgift's fleet, the 2nd Pacific Squadron was in some serious trouble. St. Petersburg sought to assemble a 3rd Pacific Squadron from the Black Sea, but this was diplomatically impossible. Russia had an ongoing issue with Turkey, thus trapping their Black Fleet within the sea. So a 3rd Pacific Squadron would consist of warships previously rejected by Rozhdestvensky, such as the older battleships Imperator Nikolai I, which would be the flagship, General Admiral Graf Apraskin, Admiral Sinevin, Admiral Ushakov, Cruiser Vladimir Monomakh, and 7 other auxiliaries. The squadron was to be led by Rear Admiral Nikolai Nibogatov, and they departed Libava on February the 15th, passing through the Suez Canal to meet up with the rest. Meanwhile, the IJN expected to see the Baltic Fleet around the Formosan Straits by early January of 1905. The massive amount of delays prompted Rozhdestvensky to say to his staff, "Telegraph to St. Petersburg that I wish to be relieved of my command." Christmas brought Rozhdestvensky out of his depression, and soon his squadron met up with Felkazam at Noisy on January the 10th. While coaling up, Rozhdestvensky had met with his other commanders to issue the orders they had received from St. Petersburg. They were to meet up with the incoming 3rd Pacific Squadron, and, combined, would regain command of the sea. To achieve this aim, they would need to strike the IJN Combined Fleet as quickly as possible, because the Japanese had been at sea for nearly a year, and perhaps they might be worn out by this point. Yet Rozhdestvensky had his own thoughts on the matter, and he made them known to the Russian Admiralty when he signaled, "I have not the slightest prospect of recovering command of the sea with the force under my orders. The dispatch of reinforcements composed of untested and in some cases badly built vessels would only render the fleet more vulnerable. In my view, the only possible course is to use all force to break through to Vladivostok and from this base to threaten the enemy's communications." At this point, the German courtiers declared they would not further support the Russian fleet east of Madagascar, prompting Rozhdestvensky into another depression. Meanwhile, Captain Nicholas Klado, who had departed after the Dogger Bank incident, was back in St. Petersburg writing about his views on the upcoming battle. "The personnel of the expedition, after hearing of the fate of Port Arthur and the destruction of our fleet, had no longer any faith in the success of our enterprise. We shall never in this war gain command of the sea. That is, we shall never accomplish the task imposed upon us. What ought to be done? It is shameful to acknowledge it, but I say, quite impartially, it is necessary to put an end to the naval operations." Russian crew members read such words, and the demoralizing effect was great. Added to this, word of Bloody Sunday and the unrest back home began to spread amongst the crews. There was a bread shortage. There was an incredible amount of discomfort amongst the crews because of the extreme heat, and, well, try imagining coaling up all day under it. Many of the men began to lose their minds. Many actually committed suicide, too. Many court-martials began to occur. During some of the training exercises, ships hit another by accident and narrowly ran into each other. Terrible news came from Mukden that Kuropatkin had been served yet again another defeat. Then on March the 15th, news that the 3rd Pacific Squadron was coaling up at Crete came. Rozhdestvensky's fleet had traveled 4,560 miles, pausing no further than 5 times to coal up. But now they were stuck, waiting for the incoming 3rd Squadron, in alien waters. On April the 14th, the Russian fleet entered Camaran Bay. Many crews began mutinies, suicides were rampant, and desertions occurred at every port call. On May the 9th, the 3rd Pacific Squadron finally arrived. Nebogatov met with Rozhdestvensky for just 30 minutes without any battle plans given before they set sail. The fleet was now 52 warships strong. Rozhdestvensky had signaled the Admiralty, "I will not telegraph you again before the battle. If I am beaten, Togo will tell you. If I beat him, I will let you know." Now at this point, I think it's pretty important to point out the differences between the two fleets. The Japanese would be enjoying some technological advantages. The IJN had electric firing mechanisms, superior ammunition, and telescopic sights. The Russians did not. Basically, the way gunnery worked up to this point had a local gunnery officer assigned to a gun. The man would specify elevation, deflection figures, and give firing orders, keeping his eyes on an inclinometer that helped indicate the roll and the pitch angles of the ship. A spotter on a mast would calculate the new elevation and deflection when observing salvos for the next round. Basically, quite a few guys are doing math during a heated battle to keep correcting salvo shots. It's very difficult stuff. Yet months before the battle we are about to talk about, Chief Gunnery Officer Lieutenant Commander Kato Hiroharu was advised by the Royal Navy on how to utilize a new mechanism. This mechanism was called the demoralized fire control computer. Yes, it was one of the earliest analog computers, I guess you could say. Now there would be a system of centrally issuing gun laying and salvo firing orders. This saw a central system allowing the spotter to identify a salvo of distant shell splashes much more effectively than trying to identify a single splash amongst the countless going on in the battle. Furthermore, the spotter now only needs to track one at a time, as opposed to using multiple stopwatches and tracking multiple shots simultaneously. He would report it to an officer on the bridge, who just happened to be steps away from the ship commander, so the captain could order course alterations to help out. This new fire control system was introduced to the entire fleet, and they trained using it for months before the Russians showed up. This would make the Japanese gunners incredibly more accurate than their foe. And I know that was all pretty confusing sounding, but to simply just put it, modern gunnery fire control systems had just emerged, and it would be the Japanese actually using them. Think of it like this. This fire control system is basically similar to the one that'll be used during World War I. So for lack of better words, it's as if the Japanese from World War I went back in time to face the Russians, who are probably working with late 19th century tactics and technology. The Japanese had also created their own radios based on the Royal Navy's Marconi wireless system. The Russians, on the other hand, were using the Telefunken German radio system. Thus, the Japanese had their own equipment and were specialized in its use. But the Russians had a foreign-produced technology they did not fully understand. They literally had Germans on board going throughout this entire great journey, showing them how to operate the radios. The Japanese were also using a high-explosive shell filled with shimose powder. Shimose powder was a pure picric acid that engineer Shimose Masachiha had created for the IJN. This powder gave stronger power in terms of detonation velocity and temperature than any other high-explosive shells of the time. The Japanese shells were also using the engine fuses that caused them to explode on contact and would wreck upper structures of ships better. And yes, the Japanese were in possession of probably the best shells in the world at this point. It was a rather ingenious little discovery they made. Now, because of the rather insane journey across the entire globe, the Russian battleships were not maintained very well, and her crews were unable to train adequately. You really have to think of it this way. The Russians had been on the move every single day. They had never had a chance to train. Every time they would go to a port, they would just be coaling up. So the men were all miserable, as you can see by the suicides and mutinies. They were certainly demoralized, and they had no time to adequately train, especially in gunnery. Meanwhile, the Japanese had been spending months simply training on gunnery, on how to use some of their new technologies, and they would be a very formidable force. Now, to geek out a bit, I want to run some numbers. The Russians had an overwhelming advantage in number of battleships and large caliber guns. They would have 41 guns of 10 and 12-inch caliber, while Togo would have about 17. However, the IJN would have a lot more guns of medium caliber, 8 and 6 inches for example, and a ton more torpedoes. The Japanese fleet overall was much faster, going at least 15 knots versus the Russian 11. The Russians had 8 battleships, 9 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 9 torpedo boats during this battle. The Japanese would have 5 battleships, 8 armored cruisers, and 16 cruisers of various degrees, 16 destroyers, and over 69 torpedo boats at various times. By the way, you will find dramatically differing numbers on the size of both fleets when you look this battle up. Also, the type of ships might change around because there's arguments as to what is a armored cruiser versus what's a light cruiser at this time, and dreadnoughts are available to some of them. It's a little confusing. The total number of Russian armored ships of modern type was 11 against the Japanese 14. The total broadside of the two armored fleets, if concentrated, was, for the Russians, 20 12-inch, 8 10-inch, 10 8-inch, 65 6-inch, and for the Japanese it would be 24 12-inch, 1 10-inch, 30 8-inch, and 92 6-inch. The Japanese had thus an advantage in number of armored ships, and a marked advantage in weight of broadsides, with common shell of about 37,600 pounds for the Japanese against 26,500 pounds for the Russians. Rodzivensky had to choose whether he would go east or west of the Japanese home islands to get to Vladivostok. If he were to go east, he could go through either the Tsuguru or La Pérouse Strait, but Russian intelligence believed that Tsuguru Strait was heavily mined and was prone to fog, thus favoring destroyers who could hide and launch torpedoes. La Pérouse was similar, but more difficult to navigate and a lot further, requiring more coal. In the west, there were 2 other channels through the Korean Straits. The western one was known to be full of Japanese bases. The eastern one was the Tsushima Strait. Admiral Togo knew the Russians would not risk going east. It was simply too far and would be too risky. Both commanders came to the conclusion the most logical route was through Tsushima. It was going to be a game of cat and mouse. Rozdivensky would be playing the role of mouse, trying to slip through to Vladivostok. Togo would be playing the role of the cat. Togo took his entire fleet to Masan Bay on the southeast coast of Korea, awaiting his prey. Rozdivensky deployed his fleet in 2 columns. In the starboard column were the 7 battleships, with their flagship being Knyaz Severov. The port column, consisting of the rest of the fleet, was led by Nebogatov aboard Nicholas I. On the night of May the 26th, the Russians slipped into the Tsushima Strait under radio silence. There was a very thick fog blanketing the area, but the moon shone heavily through the overcast. The fog lifted momentarily around 2:45 a.m., and an armored merchant cruiser named the Shinano Maru saw the hospital ship Orel, whose lights were on. The Japanese ship crept closer to investigate and relayed a message back to Masan Bay. The enemy sighted in number 203 section. He seems to be steering for the eastern channel. Togo was jolted with excitement. At 5 a.m., the IJN Combined Fleet set sail to intercept the enemy. The Orel mistook the Shinano Maru for a Russian ship and made no signal of its presence. Meanwhile, the Shinano Maru sighted the shapes of 10 other Russian warships. The Japanese officers pulled out rum and cigars, gifts from Emperor Meiji. They were passed out, and Togo recalled when the men found out that they had figured out where the Russians were in the Tsushima Strait. The news was received with enthusiastic joy by the whole fleet. At 6:34 a.m., Admiral Togo sent a signal to the naval minister in Tokyo. In response to the warning that enemy ships have been sighted, the combined fleet will immediately commence action and attempt to attack and destroy them. Weather today fine, but high waves. The Japanese closed in on their enemy, and Togo recalled, through a heavy fog covered the sea, making it impossible to observe anything at a distance of over 5 miles. All the conditions of the enemy were as clear to us, who were 30 or 40 miles distant, as though they had been under our very eyes. At 1:40 p.m., both fleets sighted each other and prepared themselves for battle. At 1:55 p.m., Togo ordered the hoisting of the Z flag, and he issued the predetermined announcement to his entire fleet. The Empire's fate depends on the results of this battle. Let every man do his utmost duty. It was as Admiral Nelson had once signaled. England expects that every man will do his duty. This was at the famous Battle of Trafalgar. Togo was inspired to make this a legendary battle as well. The Russians were sailing southwest to northeast, while the Japanese steamed from northeast to southwest. Togo ordered his fleet to turn in sequence with the Russians. Both fleets were 7 miles from another. The Japanese were coming in line-ahead formation at 14 knots, 3 knots faster than the Russians. Flagship Mikasa led her sisters Shikishima, Fuji, and Asahi, as Togo seized the initiative. Togo had his faster fleet outpace the Russians and cross them at a starboard to port, northwest then west, thus effectively crossing the Russian T. It was a tremendously risky maneuver as the Russian gunnery teams went to work firing upon the Japanese. Mikasa took 15 hits within just 5 minutes. Shikishima likewise took hits. Togo's 12 large ships were performing in essence a giant U-turn, taking over 20 minutes under heavy Russian fire. Each one of Togo's ships had to run the gauntlet, suffering hits. The Russian 3rd Division concentrated upon the Japanese cruisers at the extremity of their range, with some success. The Yagumo, Asama, and Nisin were all hit. Asama was forced out of line. Then the battle passed out of range for Nebogatov's division, who were hitting 11 knots, limiting the speed of the entire Russian fleet. Once Fuji and Asahi completed their turn, Togo ordered his fleet to open fire targeting Suvorov and Osaya, who were leading the 2 Russian lines. The danger for the Japanese had passed. Now Rostevensky was in trouble. Rostevensky only had 2 options laid before him: to charge directly, in line abreast, or to commence a formal pitched battle. He chose the latter. The Japanese unleashed their 500 guns upon the flagship of Rostevensky, and aboard the Suvorov the crews were shocked by the overwhelming and accurate fire laid upon them. Captain Vladimir Semenov recalled this: I had not only never witnessed such a fire before, but I had never imagined anything like it. Shells seemed to be pouring upon us incessantly, one after another. It seemed impossible even to count the number of projectiles striking us. The steel plates and superstructure on the upper decks were torn to pieces, and the splinters caused many casualties. Iron ladders were crumpled up into rings. Guns were literally hurled from their mountings. In addition to this, there was an unusually high temperature and liquid flame of the explosion, which seemed to spread over everything. I actually watched a steel plate catch fire from a burst. Meanwhile, the Russians' near misses outnumbered their hits, and 1/3 of their shells were actually failing to explode. The Russian command center was in the armored conning tower above the ailing Suvorov, now alight from stem to stern, from 12, 8, and 6-inch shells. 2 shells struck the conning tower, killing countless men. Rostevensky struggled to lead his fleet closer to the enemy to achieve effective striking power. Then, at 2:35 p.m., he was wounded for the first time. The Japanese gunnery had a devastating effect on the Russian crews, so much so the returning fire became relatively indifferent and ineffective. The sailors were mesmerized by the sheer slaughter before them. Main armaments were shaken and snuffed out. Semenov recalled running past sailors, seeing them in shell shock, trying to scream at the men to help put out the fires. By 2:30, a funnel had gone. The mainmast was destroyed. Signaling was made impossible. A shell hit the flagship's steering mechanism, and now she was veering off to starboard, completely ablaze. Aboard the Asahi, Captain Pakenham was in a deck chair taking notes of the spectacle. Togo had taken Pakenham as an attaché from the Royal Navy. Pakenham had been watching through binoculars while a nearby officer was picking up the debris and mutilated feet, hands, and bowels from crew members. Pakenham was writing notes until a 6-inch shell killed the entire crew of a 12-inch gun nearby him. The crew were blown to pieces, and a man's lower jaw hit Pakenham, drenching him with blood. Pakenham wrote down, "In spite of the quantity scattered, The amount of blood left on the deck looked sufficient to fill a big cask. He then put down his notebook, and he went down below. But he would return 5 minutes later, after he put on a new uniform, and he resumed his note-taking. Why did this man act in such a way? Because he knew, even then, this was to be a legendary battle. Osaya was fatally damaged with her medical surgeons busy with dying men. Water rushed through the ship on the lower decks and into her magazines. She was gradually listing as medical teams continued their work. 6 IGN cruisers pulled up for the coup de grace, as told to us by Admiral Kamimura. The whole of the starboard side, as far as the keel, was laid bare. Her bright plating looked like the wet scales of some sea monster, and then suddenly, as if by command, all the men who had crowded to the starboard side jumped down upon those scales. Most of them were dashed against the bilge keel and fell crippled into the sea. In the water they formed an imaginable mass, and the enemy's shell never ceased, the whole time from bursting over them. A few more seconds and Osaya disappeared beneath the water. Sailors abandoned the ship, some in such a hurry they failed to even grab a life vest. The captain screamed to his men to swim away from the ship, which was keel high by 2:45 p.m. She went bow first to the boot with nearly 2/3 of her entire crew. Osaya was the first armored battleship in history to be sunk entirely by naval gunfire. The speed difference between the two fleets had been a decisive factor, as one Japanese observer wrote. After the first 20 minutes, the Russians seemed suddenly to go all to pieces, and their shooting became wild and harmless. At this point, the situation in the conning tower aboard Suvorov was catastrophic. Rozhdestvensky was wounded yet again. He took a shell fragment to the head, and he was knocked out. A fragment had also entered his left leg, cutting the main nerve and paralyzing his limb. Rozhdestvensky was dragged into a gun turret where he groggily was coming to. His chief of staff asked, "Sir, we must shorten the distance. They're all being killed. They're on fire." Rozhdestvensky would reply, "Wait a bit, aren't we all being killed also?" The flagship drifted east out of control, leaving the Alexander III to take the head of the line. Captain Bukhvostov aboard Alexander III took Togo by surprise, and he charged down the middle of his squadron. This action gained the other Russians much-needed respite. Yet before long, Alexander III was being absolutely battered and began to list from a hole in her bows. Then the lead passed on to Borodino, who soon became ablaze, joined by Orel. At this point, Nebogatov should have assumed command of the entire fleet, but he was unaware of the status of Rozhdestvensky, or even Verkazam, who had been dead for days, actually. Rozhdestvensky had kept this a secret to thwart Nebogatov from becoming second in command. Rozhdestvensky had simply locked the door to the room Verkazam was in, not telling pretty much anybody about this. Thus, for 3 hours, no one was in command of the Russian fleet. Togo's attention was then stolen by the now stationary and devastated Suvorov. As Pakenham would write, "Her condition seemed infinitely deplorable. Smoke curling round the stern was rolling horizontally, away on the wind. If the absence of funnels contributed much to her air of distress, the now extensive conflagration raging amid ships showed its reality." Togo began firing into Suvorov from only 1,000 yards, before sailing off to intercept the other battleships. This allowed Kawamura's cruisers and 2 divisions of destroyers to close in like sharks. Togo had been so transfixed on the enemy flagship, he had lost sight of the battle as a whole. According to him, "The enemy apparently altered course and disappeared into the fog." Togo took a northward pursuit of the Russian fleet, who were trying to escape the carnage. Mikasa had been hit over 29 times, showcasing the brutality of the fight. The Russian destroyer Buene raced through the Japanese armada, coming beside Suvorov's side. Rozhdestvensky was carried by his chief of staff, who said in distress, "Come on, sir. We haven't much time. There are some cruisers coming up." The barely conscious Rostevensky, with his skull pierced by a shell splinter, protested and then said, "Command to Nebogatov, Vladivostok, course N-23E." The wounded admiral was tossed aboard the destroyer as Kamamuro's cruisers charged from the east. Destroyer Bueni carried the admiral and 200 of Osaya's survivors. There was not much more room for the men of Suvorov. Only a dozen managed to jump aboard. Those remaining on Suvorov manned their workable guns and fought like lions against their executioners. Admiral Katoka recalled the scene. "She scarcely looked like a man of war at all. Her interior was ablaze, and the holes in her side and gun ports shot out tongues of flame. Thick volumes of black smoke rolled low on her deck, and her whole appearance was indescribably pathetic. She turned to starboard and port as if seeking to escape, while the 2 or 3 stern guns, which were all that remained to her, kept up a heroic defense." To finally put Suvorov out of her misery, Katoka had his 11th Torpedo Division come up at 20 knots and fire a salvo of torpedoes. 3 out of the 7 torpedoes hit and exploded, one finding her magazine that caused a tremendous blast, turning her over. Katoka recalled, "For a short time she floated upwards, and then at 7:30 lifted her bow high in the air and slid rapidly out of sight." Suvorov took 40 officers and 888 men with her down. Meanwhile, Alexander III was sinking, taking 30 officers and 806 men with her. Fuji was one of the last to fire her 12-inch guns at Borodino as the sun was setting. Her shells tore through the ship, detonating the magazines, causing a tremendous amount of explosions, and smoke was going everywhere. Of her crew of 30 officers and 823 men that would go down with the ship, she would have a single survivor. Admiral Enquist, commanding the Russian cruisers, used the cover of darkness to try and break contact and flee. The Aurora, Jemchug, and Oleg fled in the direction of Manila. The slower Dmitry Donskoy was left behind and would become an easy target for the IGN light cruisers and torpedo boats. Dmitry Donskoy was smashed with both shell and torpedo and would sink with every man killed and wounded aboard. To make matters even worse, Dmitry Donskoy had taken on 270 survivors from Osaya and Bueni before she was attacked. She had put up a valiant fight, managing to sink 2 IGN destroyers and damaging a third. That is to say, these were claims by the Russians. The Russians had lost battleships Suvorov, Osaya, Alexander III, and Borodino, but the night was still young. At 8 p.m., 21 destroyers and 45 torpedo boats ran circles around the Russian vessels, who had not escaped in time. The IGN small warships hit them from the east and south for over 3 hours without pause. During the night, numerous collisions occurred between both sides. The Japanese shepherded the Russians into small pockets, who kept trying to escape northwards. By 11 p.m., it seemed like the Russians had all escaped. Then searchlights all came on. The old battleship Navarin ran into a chained float mine and was hit consecutively by 4 torpedoes until she sank, taking down her crew of 622 men. There would only be 3 survivors. I will note, other accounts state that she only hit a mine, which was chained to other mines, and that a perhaps other mine hit her again. I am using primarily one source to tell you this battle because it becomes too confusing to use multiple sources, and it really does change the order of things. 2 older armored cruisers, Vladimir Monomakh and Admiral Nakihimov, were badly damaged by shellfire and torpedoes. The night had been a war of attrition, and the morning showcased the remnants of Nebogatov's squadron. Nicholas I, Orel, Apraxin, Sinyavin, and the cruiser Izumrud had been hightailing it for Vladivostok. Many of them were pulling 9 knots, and if allowed to flee, they would have made a 32-hour journey to the Coldwater port. However, they would not be allowed to leave. When the morning light shone brightly enough, the Japanese recommenced their hunt. Nebogatov would find himself surrounded by nearly 27 IGN warships. Togo made sure to keep his larger warships out of gun range of the Russians, and he allowed his destroyers and torpedo boats to finish off the ailing enemy. The Japanese had surrounded Nebogatov's remaining warships at 5:23 a.m., just a bit south of Takeshima Island. Nebogatov knew that they were doomed. He addressed his fellow officers. Gentlemen, I propose to surrender as the only means of saving our crews from destruction. Please give orders to run up the white flag. And here you're going to have a bit of a confusing situation that has been told in multiple sources quite differently. Nebelgatov had the XJE signal raised. This was an international signal of surrender. The Japanese would claim they did not have this signal in their codebooks, or at least they did not recognize it immediately. Again, it depends on the source you read. Japanese officers began to scour their books for the signal, but while this was going on, they continued to fire upon the Russian ships as the Izumrud suddenly bolted northwards, escaping at 24 knots. Now, although Nebelgatov had raised the XJE signal, he did not kill his engines, which was in violation of using such a signal. You had to kill your engines as well. Being fired upon and in a panic, he quickly demanded his men find whatever they can to hoist that was white. And some officers came up with some white tablecloths, and they were hoisted up the mastheads. Now, this entire time, IJN officers were pointing out to Admiral Togo that they believed the XGE signal meant that they were trying to surrender. And now with the presence of these white flags, it seemed even more evident. Unfortunately, Admiral Togo had been duped once by a Qing warship who hoisted a white flag before fleeing in 1894 during the First Sino-Japanese War. So he ordered them to continue firing. The IJN officers aboard Mikasa tried to get Togo to order a ceasefire, but Togo replied, "I will not cease fire until they stop their engines." For by this point, the signal had been found in the signal books. IJN officers and sailors were making frantic hand gestures at the Russians, and it seems the Russians finally figured it out, as they soon raised the rising sun flag on their mastheads, and then they killed their engines. To this, Togo finally ordered a ceasefire. Nebelgatov looked at his men and he said, "You are young, and it is to you who will one day retrieve the honor and glory of the Russian Navy. The lives of 2,400 men in these ships are more important than mine." Thus ended the Battle of Tsushima. The wounded Admiral Rostevensky was taken to Sasebo for medical treatment. Admiral Togo would visit Rostevensky while he was in the hospital, and he consoled the man, saying this: "We fighting men suffer either way, win or lose. The only question is whether or not we do our duty. You performed your great task heroically until you were incapacitated. I pay you my highest respects." The Russian Navy had suffered 216 officers and 4,614 men killed. 278 officers and 5,629 men were taken prisoner. 62 officers, 1,165 men had managed to escape to Vladivostok and Diego Cerez, and another 79 officers and 1,783 men were interned at neutral ports. The IJN had suffered 117 officers and men killed, including one very young Japanese officer aboard the armored cruiser Nishin. He would lose an index and middle finger on his left hand. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto. The Russians lost 11 battleships sunk, scuttled, or captured. 5 out of 9 cruisers, 6 out of 9 destroyers, and a bunch of auxiliary ships joined them. The Japanese lost a whopping 3 torpedo boats, number 34, 35, and 69. It was an insane victory, nearly flawless. News of the terrible defeat reached St. Petersburg, absolutely stunning the Russian government and the Tsar. The Russian government quickly sought a scapegoat and targeted Admiral Rostevensky, accusing him of defeatism and failing to properly employ his fleet. Rostevensky was put on trial, and he said to the judges, "We were just not strong enough, and God gave us no luck." Rostevensky told everyone the blame was his and his alone to bear, but they sought further blood and came for Nebelgatov and 2 other members of the Commander-in-Chief's staff. Death sentences were tossed. In response, Nebelgatov addressed the court. "According to the judges who have sentenced me to a shameful punishment, I should have blown the ships up on the high seas and caused the death of 2,000 men in a few seconds. For what reason? Perhaps in the name of St. Andrew's flag, symbol of Holy Russia? A great country must preserve her dignity and life of her sons, and not send them to death on ancient vessels in order to hide her errors, intellectual blindness, and ignorance of the most elementary principles of naval matters. Tsar Nicholas II would commute the death sentences, but the damage done to his empire would be fatal. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Right now I'm releasing a multi-part series on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. And please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where you can find more exclusive podcasts. This month's exclusive podcast is me answering why the Japanese performed so many atrocities during World War II. It's a rather difficult question, and a brutal one at that. Oh, and please note, you can take a free trial of my Patreon at any time, and you can gain access to those exclusive podcasts just to try it out. Please do. The Baltic Fleet of Rozdevensky made an incredible journey around the globe to bring the full might of the Russian Navy to Japan's doorstep. Admiral Togo predicted where his foe would be, and he gave him one of, if not the greatest naval battles in history. Now the Russians remained defeated on land and sea. Only peace could ensue.